All right, there's a mystery in Moscow this morning. One of Russia's top generals, who reportedly knew that mercenaries were planning to launch an armed rebellion, is apparently missing. Now, CNN asked the Kremlin about his whereabouts. They told us no comment. Just yesterday, the New York Times reported that General Sergei Surovikin knew about the plot, and U.S. intelligence was trying to figure out if he actually helped to plan it.
So the Moscow Times is reporting that he is under arrest. They are citing Russian defense sources, but we have not been able to independently verify that. There have been reports from Russian military bloggers and other journalists that the general hasn't been seen in days and that he might be under interrogation and that he hasn't been in contact with his family. Nick Payton-Walsh joins us live this morning from Kyiv with more. Nick, this general was once, for a brief period of time, but once the top commander of the war in Ukraine.
Absolutely, and considered pretty competent and effective when he had that role. Sergei Surovikin was demoted and put in charge of the Air Force with a deputy role in the Ukraine war after people considered over the winter that the fight around Kherson had gone against the Kremlin. Now, he's also one of the few commanders that Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Wagner rebellion leader, spoke complimentarily of. Now, he was last seen on Friday, as this rebellion got underway, appearing somewhat uncomfortable on a video, essentially telling everyone to stand down, go back to their bases, and to not continue the march on Moscow. He's not been seen since. Now, it's important to point out, too, that, for example, Valery Gerasimov, the chief of staff of Russia's war here in Ukraine, he's also not been seen in public, too. But Surovikin has been the subject of this morass now of reports suggesting in the New York Times that perhaps he had foreknowledge. I've been told by a European intelligence official that there are hints some of the Russian military establishment may have had foreknowledge, but also to reports suggesting perhaps he's been arrested, perhaps he's been interrogated. There are other Russian commentators saying actually no, he's okay. The issue really, though, is until we see him healthy and in public, this speculation will continue to mount. And also, too, frankly, this suspicion will hang over Surovikin probably indefinitely. Now, this is the beginning, I think, of what many observers thinking would be the fallout of the weekend, that there's suspicion in the Russian military elite, in Putin's inner circle, about who knew what. Some of this perhaps planted in the Western media to obviously hobble Russia's chain of command. But this will continue to play out. The fear possibly of purges or turmoil will continue to escalate, and it's going to make command and control for the war in Ukraine, for Vladimir Putin, increasingly hard. They're doing very badly in terms of decision-making so far, but if indeed what we're seeing now is generals turning on each other, pointing the finger, disappearing, having to appear in public looking healthy just to prove that they're okay and still in their job, that's going to be a massive distraction from the war in itself. And remember, too, it doesn't suggest that Vladimir Putin has a strong grip on power if we have all this doubt about where his key commanders indeed are. Poppy?
Nick Payton-Walsh, live from Kyiv. Thank you very much.
Well, we're joined now by CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger. He's also a White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times. David, I think it's important here to take people behind the scenes in terms of what we identify in a Kremlin response versus maybe what a normal person would read.
Right.
When the Kremlin is talking about just speculation when they're asked about the whereabouts of a general, when the Ministry of Defense is not commenting when they're asked about a whereabouts of a prominent general, my alarm bells go up immediately.
Right.
Yours?
There's no such thing as a free no comment, because no comments frequently tell you almost as much as a comment would. So the first thing they did in responding to the Times story written by my colleagues was that it was speculation, right? That's not exactly a denial. And then they wouldn't say where he was. So why is this so critical to them? Because part of the Putin argument, as he has tried to recover from the weekend, has been to say the people were behind me and my military was behind me. Well, this suggests that one of his senior generals was not, and it would be hard to believe that they would stage this with just one general.
Isn't that the key question?
Right.
Is how many of these Russian generals, Russian military heads, knew what Prigozhin was planning?
How many knew, and how many just made sure they were out of town? I mean, the remarkable thing is that Prigozhin's force, only, 6,000 or 7,000 of them, made its way unopposed down a main highway toward Moscow and made it within, what, 125, 150
Yeah.
miles of the capital, having run into very little opposition. A little bit of air bombing, and they took out. It's clear that they killed a number of Russian
Can I
pilots.
just ask you before we move on to this other story that's fascinating this morning on the Chinese spy balloon? You know, Bianca Golodryga with us this week brought up the comparison to Erdogan in 2016 and, you know, what happens when you are challenged or threatened in this way. And you raised the question of, you know, what is more dangerous right now, a strong, paranoid Putin or a weaker, paranoid Putin?
Right. I think the answer is a weaker, paranoid Putin, right? So Putin was paranoid before this happened. He now has discovered he had really good reason to be paranoid, you know? And so at this point, he's trying to do two things, I think. One is establish that he's fully in control. But secondly, if he's feeling cornered, if he's feeling like some of his military has moved against him, and that the United States and NATO are going to take advantage of that when they all show up in Vilnius in you know, a week and a half's time for the NATO summit, I think he is much more likely to threaten the use of his weapons, to reveal the weapons that he's put in Belarus, nuclear weapons he's put in Belarus, to issue more threats than he would be if he was feeling in a strong position.
Well, issuing threats has not been something he's been hesitant to do to some degree. And I understand what you're saying. There are scales of an escalatory ladder in terms of the threats. Do you feel like more dangerous in a weaker position means utilizing or delivering on those threats is more likely?
Well, I think you'll see a bunch of steps between now and, God forbid, an actual use. He's threatened. He's never actually moved any nuclear weapons. You know, we haven't seen any activity. That would be sort of the next thing to do to try to spook the United States. Clearly, he feels at this point that not only is the war not going well, but it's beginning to take a toll on his own military. And he can't be seen to lose this, because if he loses, if he pulls back, you know, maybe he'd get away with it, maybe not. Now, you made a really good point, Poppy, about President Erdogan. We all thought in 2016 when there was a coup attempt against him.
Bianca's good point, but yes.
No, co-opted. Take it
point.
for yourself. Don't give anybody credit. This is TV, Pop.
That's right.
Brutal business.
It is. It's pretty cutthroat. You think the Russian military is bad, right? So the key issue here, I think, is that as Putin sort of, you know, heads down this road, we're going to have a lot of different moments where we're going to have to go see whether or not his activity, his actions have differed dramatically from what they were before. So far, he's been playing to type. We don't know that that's going to, you know, continue along the way.
And if he follows